Ladies and gentlemen, make welcome Funke Opeke. She needs a standing ovation. Give it to her. She deserves one. Appreciate her. An Amazon.
Thank you very much. Welcome to Techpoint 2019. What I'm here to talk about is technology infrastructure, and hopefully I know a few things about that, and especially as it relates to our region of the world, Nigeria, West Africa, in which I am indeed a practitioner. When we look at Africa, when we look at West Africa, the future, I think, is bright. And why do I say the future is bright, and why do we have the opportunity to be inspired? The future is bright, and the opportunities are there because of you, because of us, and because of technology. And that's really what I am going to be talking about this morning. When we look at our environment, it's not about oil and gas. It's not about agriculture. How many of us are going to go to the farm with hoe and cutlass? It's not really about that. And if we're farming, we're going to be adopting technology to make that farming more productive. It's about tech, and tech needs infrastructure. And I was going to start by just giving some demographic information. When you look at our section of the world today, Nigeria, 190 million of us, or 200 million, about 50% of that population under 18. When you look across the world, you look at the projections for 2050 in terms of where the global workforce is going to be, then certainly Nigeria and Africa play a significant role in that. In addition to the strong, compelling youth population, we are a society that's rapidly gaining access to technology. And that access started in form of mobile, but as we've increasingly moved to smartphones and having access to the internet, then that access is changing. Okay, thank you very much. Africa, the future's bright. Nigeria, a big part of that. 1.3 billion, 1 billion people and growing, half of whom are under the age of 20. As I was saying, we're increasingly gaining access, next slide, I don't have a clicker, to the internet, because within the past 10 years, submarine cables have been built. We built one, the first private one, in West Africa to connect West Africa, Nigeria, to the rest of the world. Today, we have more than adequate submarine cable capacity connecting us to the internet, and clearly the upsurge that we've seen in tech, the digital revolution that is starting to take place and that we expect more of in the next decade, is being driven by the availability of that connectivity. But the submarine cables are not enough. And if you go to the next slide, you will see that several countries, what that map on the left shows, are the countries that have more than adequate capacity. And other than that stream of landlocked countries in the middle, most of the African countries, Nigeria included, now have more than adequate connectivity on the coasts. However, what the slide on the right shows, and the text, is that despite the fact that we have adequate connectivity to the internet from our countries, in terms of our individual access within the countries to technologies that enable that, the last mile to the end user or to the businesses, for example, with 4G, and here in Nigeria, where telecommunications is essentially mobile or wireless technologies, because we don't have the infrastructure, coverage of 4G is still in the 30% range. So in some countries, Rwanda has taken great steps. They're closer to 100%. South Africa is pushing 80, but here in Nigeria, we're still in the 30% range. That is continuing to change. But if you're not in the center of Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt, and perhaps some very limited other cities, some of our mobile operators are starting to roll out that technology. Our technology and access to data services is still constrained. So when you look particularly in Nigeria, as I mentioned, you have this large, can you go back? This large population with an increasing number of us connected to the internet, but the quality of those connections still leaves a lot to be desired. Next slide. Versus the rest of the world, how are we ranked? And we've just cited some studies that have been done to show the infrastructure challenges or the depth of the infrastructure challenges that we have in the ICT space. So when we look at it, we're ranked 70 out of 79 in terms of broadband, which is actually connecting all around, in terms of data centers, cloud, access to big data technologies, and the Internet of Things. Now, we talk about the fourth industrial revolution. We're going to be talking about all these various domains of technology here today. Without the underlying infrastructure, clearly we have a challenge. Next slide. How does that translate? If you're trying to drive an application, or you're trying to do some machine learning or AI or big data analysis, where you try to do some inference and you initiate a query, how quickly does it come back? And if you're here in Nigeria, unfortunately, I think our rankings against most of the world is we're 153rd position out of 200 countries that were measured. Why do we have that? Next slide, please. It's been a highly complex journey. I showed you the slide earlier that said we had 5 submarine cables. None of these cables are full. So why is it that we do not have, can we have the next slide? Why is it that we do not have better access to the internet? And it's really a dearth of infrastructure, particularly fiber optic infrastructure across our cities. So we do have, all the large operators have built connecting Lagos to Abuja, but we haven't thought about distributing anywhere else. So we just do the major pipes. It's like you have the highway, and everybody built their highway, private highway on the same road, but we don't have all the feeder networks, so you still have to come through the dirt road to get to the highway, and of course all kinds of congestions and breakdowns take place, so you're not able to get the information out. We also have to look at how our infrastructure environment here in Nigeria has evolved, and we're not doing a lot of infrastructure sharing. And when you look at the GDP per capita in Nigeria of less than $2,000 a person, and you look at advanced economies that have GDPs of 30,000, 40,000 per capita, then you have to say, if we're going to have access to the same kind of technology, we've got to be really creative in how we deploy that technology. And we've got to think of sharing strategies. We've got to think of the right set of government incentives in terms of taxes or fees that you pay to be able to deploy that technology, because these technologies are actually enablers. And if we're charging a lot of input taxes or putting a lot of conditions because we think the telecommunications companies make a lot of money, then you're going to limit that infrastructure being put in place, because putting the infrastructure in place in the first instance is very expensive. So that is the challenge that we have, and as a result, data remains really constrained for a lot of us in terms of the quality and the quantity of access that we have. So if I were to sum it up, I would say there are 2 challenges. One, the infrastructure, and the second, the skill gap that we face. The hard investments that are required in infrastructure and getting that in place with the population explosion that we have, and the need across the country with growing appetite for data, and then the skills to rapidly take advantage of the technology that's increasingly being enabled by that, and the skills also to make those services relevant to the opportunities and challenges that we do face in our society. Indeed, one of my favorite slides of all time says that terrestrial fiber is indeed the mother of all bottlenecks to internet access and data quality of service across Africa, and no other I would say representation, no better representation of that than the giant African elephant. So indeed, we have an elephant in the room. Why do we have this elephant? And what's the role of fiber in a digital economy? I think for a lot of us, we start in fiber, we don't even have light. So I will acknowledge that when we talk about infrastructure, clearly we recognize the need for consistent electricity. We recognize the need for roadways and transportation so that we can actually physically connect our people. However, once you move beyond that, we need to start talking about this connectivity that allows us move information. And others have drawn the analogy that fiber optics and broadband connectivity is to the digital revolution what electricity was to the industrial age. If you don't have that connectivity, then you can't do tech and you can't do digital. So it's a necessary building block. On top of that, you have things like towers, you have things like data centers, where the information is actually housed and processed. And of course, the layer on top of that is software. All these wonderful applications that we're able to build once you have access to that kind of infrastructure, and you almost take it for granted because you can then be enabled and fully equipped to do what you want to do. If you want to focus on Lagos, which is the next slide, which is Nigeria's economic hub, we've seen some things happen. And we've seen some things happen, especially in some districts of Lagos. When we look at Yaba, for example, where we did a project in 2014 to extend infrastructure to some of the companies there, be it an Andela, CC Hub. We started the project with CC Hub, then we moved on, we connected Andela, Hotel.ng, Iroko. When you look at the number of companies that are able, Conga, to ride off the infrastructure and the amount of foreign direct investment that these companies have been able to bring into Nigeria because of this access, then, and as well as skill and a lot of grit and determination and hard work, then you start understanding the compelling power of technology and the impact. If that could happen in Yaba, I'm told Yaba, a lot of companies say Yaba is now too expensive. They can't afford to rent an office in Yaba. So if we do that in Yaba and we make it available all over, can you imagine what will be happening in Lagos? And really, that's a vision that we have in MainOne, where we've rolled out a plan called Digital Lagos. Digital Lagos is a plan that we have whereby we will invest up to 25 billion naira in deploying fiber optic infrastructure across all of Lagos. That infrastructure will connect every local government, it will connect towers, it will have access to schools. We certainly hope that our governments will be inspired to ensure the connections actually take place and that there's power in the schools, and the incoming administration clearly appears focused on that, so that when we talk about the scale issue, we can really start addressing that in a meaningful way, but also as we build our apps, as we try to transform our society, leveraging technology, the average person in Lagos has access to that technology. When that infrastructure is deployed, you will have more than 12 million people within 5 kilometers access to the fiber optic infrastructure, and more than 10 million within 1 kilometer, which says with most of your wireless technologies, you can indeed have superior access wherever you are in Lagos State. Next slide. The network will also be built to connect towers, which says in terms of the congestion you have on the operator networks, public Wi-Fi, smart cities. We talk about security cameras and the need for increased security across our city. It will be able to address that requirement. Next slide. We expect that this will be totally transformative to all of Lagos, and it will have broad impact across our economy here. But beyond Lagos, what are we doing and what have we seen and what is the potential for this kind of technology to have an impact? Next slide. In 2018, we actually started this project, and we did some pilot projects in Edo and Ogun states. And what we're saying is now the mobile operators are starting to connect to that infrastructure to enhance 4G services. We also have Wi-Fi providers such as Tizeti going to the cities to launch services. We're seeing more of the tertiary institutions start to come on board, some of the secondary institutions as well, to get access to the technology. I mean, this network in Ogun State just went live in March, and we're having those connections already. And I can only imagine all of the government secretariats in Ogun State already has Wi-Fi. Similar will be rolled out in Edo State within the next 3 months. So you start seeing the power that this technologies and fiber is able to bring in terms of our cities and access. But, you know, at the end of the day, you say, okay, so I have access to Wi-Fi and I have access to better internet. What does that mean to me? And I just want to share some statistics before I close. Next slide. So, you know, you think of this conference, you think of the future of work, technology. Why does it matter? The slide on the left shows relative incomes for average jobs in economies and for people working online. I'm sure we're all familiar with the Elance platform. It's a platform where you put your services online and people can subscribe. I know when I started MainOne, I got some advertising and logo design and other services through Elance. And you look at that disparity, and the hourly wage rate when you're working online in most markets is, other than in Spain, which is a very sophisticated market, is close to 5 times what you have averagely in those economies, which starts to show the power of digital and the earning potential that it brings, all with a laptop and sitting in your house. And this data is from World Bank data. But the other thing for us to note is the power of digital to scale. And with technology, you either scale or you're made irrelevant. So for us as an economy also, we need to think about where are we going to play as Nigeria, as Nigerians, and as individuals in a rapidly globalizing world. So there are 3 charts, or the 3 data sets on that chart. The yellow one is IKEA and how they've grown. The blue one is Walmart, who we used to think as a granddaddy of business growth. How can you have that scale in a retail organization? But guess what? See how late Alibaba came to the game and see how big they are. 9 million online merchants in 220 countries. That's the power of digital. And that's a power that you all have access to with an idea and a dream, and digital. Next slide. Why digital? Look again. M-Pesa versus KCB Bank. That's one of the largest banking groups in Kenya. Airbnb versus Marriott and Hilton hotels combined. How long have we been hearing of Hilton? You look at them all there and think that's a really big business. And then, two guys bumming together in San Francisco with no job come up with this idea that when people are out, we could make access available and see what they're doing on a global basis. Same thing, Didi versus license taxis. I mean, we've all seen Uber and Lyft and the speed with which they've been able to scale. And finally, that chart also just shows, in the good old days, before you could publish a book, send information, get people signed up, the need to physically transport things, the need to communicate or send things and wait for a response, digital trumps all that. And the pace at which you can actually propagate ideas, businesses, commercialize them has totally changed today. The entry barriers have also been significantly lowered. Some of this you can drive from your mobile phone. 20 years ago, if you wanted to build a website, you were probably spending tens of thousands of dollars. Today, you're spending tens of thousands of naira. If you have the skills, perhaps you can even do it for free. So, the world is rapidly changing, and technology with access to infrastructure is changing. And it is on that note that I have come to say the infrastructure is happening around you. We need to do more as a society to put that infrastructure in place. But for a population that faces a lot of unemployment, that is looking for economic opportunity, that is looking for growth, that is looking to create wealth, that is willing to create a prosperous future for ourselves, we have no choice but to go digital. I welcome you once again to the next slide, to the Techpoint Inspired Conference, and I hope that you're already inspired, and if not, you need to be inspired. Thank you very much.